Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Nick Dembowski. I'm the president of the Kingsbridge Historical Society. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I want to thank Ian Frazier, first and foremost. I want to thank Dr. Stephen Payne of the Bronx County Historical Society for coming to us with this idea for a collaboration between Bronx County Historical Society and Kingsbridge Historical Society, and I hope it's the first of many to come. I encourage all my members, all the members of the Kingsbridge Historical Society to join the Bronx County Historical Society. I've been a member for years. I enjoy reading their publications. I've been to their research library, been to their events. Definitely worth doing for a borough-wide focus. For Bronx County Historical Society members that are here, I would encourage you to sign up at the Kingsbridge Historical Society. We cover Riverdale, Kingsbridge, Marble Hill, Spite and Dival. And just as sort of an example of the kind of things we think and talk about all the time, this campus is the site where Dr. Martin Luther King in 1963 gave a speech. It's where Eleanor Roosevelt came to talk. Before it was a school, it was the home of a man named Hiram Barney. Who was that guy? He was a well-known abolitionist who Abraham Lincoln asked to be the collector of the port of New York, and who Abraham Lincoln asked to read over his Emancipation Proclamation, the first draft, for some feedback. And 80 years before that, this was German-occupied territory. This was the forward operating base of Hessian soldiers that were fighting for the British and American Revolution, right here on this campus. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Stephen Payne, who over the last recent years has done so much to expand the scope of what counts as local history here in the Bronx. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. It's great to see all of you here. How many people I hope no one had too hard of a time finding the venue and all. We had a little venue change and all because there was such demand. So great to see so many people here. And yeah, hopefully we might even offer this maybe again since there was so much interest in this event. But thank you, Nick. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom, and the Kingsbridge Historical Society for opening up this space for us. Tom has a little inside connection with the librarian here. So thank you, Tom. It's a beautiful space to be in, and looking forward to tonight's program. As I'm sure, hopefully all of you know, since you're here for a book talk on Paradise Bronx. Paradise Bronx is a book that's gotten a lot of press coverage, which is a great thing for a book on the Bronx. It doesn't often happen. So we're really proud of the coverage that the book's been getting. Excited to hear people's questions, thoughts, feedback, and hear straight from Ian more about the book. And as Nick said, we encourage everyone here, you know, if you're, whether you're a Kingsbridge Historical Society member or Bronx Historical Society member, check out both of our events. I think we complement each other very nicely. The Bronx Historical Society does a very wide range of Bronx history, you know, anything from colonial era history to very, very recent history. We have a new exhibit coming up at one of our museums, the Museum of Bronx History, which is the second oldest house currently standing in the Bronx. It's coming up on the history of Bronx heavy metal and punk rock. It's a very unknown, for the most part, topic, but there's a new exhibit opening up in April. We encourage you to check it out. We also have an exhibit there right now. It's from South Bronx Puerto Rican photography collective called Seis del Sur. It's photographs of the Bronx in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Some really beautiful photographs that challenge the narrative that everything was burning and decaying in the Bronx all the time. It's photographs of community, photographs of people making the best for themselves in their neighborhoods. So encourage you all to check that out. We also operate Edgar Allan Poe Cottage, which is typically our more famous museum. So it's a small cottage, but we have some exciting events coming up there. A little later in the spring, we've had some construction going on there for a while. I don't know if any of you have noticed it. Scaffolding, luckily, the scaffolding is down, which is an accomplishment in New York City. So Yeah. Clap for that if you want to. So without further ado, I'm going to shut up now because I'm not the reason you're here. We're here for a book talk. I'm going to introduce our moderator and also Ian. So first, our moderator. And I wish I had, queued up entry music to play as I'm reading your introductions, but I dropped the ball on that, so apologies. So Dr. Amy Starocheski. First of all, Dr. Amy Starocheski is the visiting scholar at the Bronx Historical Society for this year, but she's also many, many other things. A cultural anthropologist and oral historian whose research focuses on oral history as a social practice and the politics of history, value, and property in cities. She is the director of the Oral History MA program at Columbia University. Her book, Ours to Lose When Squatters Became Homeowners in New York City, was published in 2016 by the University of Chicago Press. She is the founder of the Mott Haven Oral History Project and currently directs the National Endowment for the Humanities funded Mott Haven History Keepers Project, which is a joint project of Columbia University's Insight Institute and us, the Bronx County Historical Society. It supports grassroots historical workers in Mott Haven. She is, as I mentioned, the 2024 through 2025 visiting scholar, anthropologist in residence at the Bronx County Historical Society. Ian Frazier is an award-winning writer and humorist. His books include, most recently, while we're here, Paradise Bronx, as well as Great Plains, Travels in Siberia, Dating Your Mom, and many other classic works of nonfiction and humor. A frequent contributor to The New Yorker, he lives in Montclair, New Jersey. So let's give it up for our presenters. And I'll just say one more thing before I turn over the microphones. Just want to make sure to acknowledge and thank a couple of elected officials who provide funding for our regular programming. City Council Member Eric Dinowitz and State Senator Gustavo Rivera, who support our events with funding each year. So thanks to them for supporting this.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about this. As soon as I read the book, I thought, it's going to be really fun to see what people in the Bronx think about this and discuss it with the Bronx audience. So I'm really glad that we're sitting here together. Do you want to start off with maybe reading a little bit so we can get a sense of how the book sounds? Does that mic work well enough for you, or do you want to hold this?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to read just a little bit from the beginning of the book. The Bronx is a hand reaching down to pull the other boroughs of New York City out of the harbor and the sea. Its fellow boroughs are islands or parts of islands. The Bronx hangs on to Manhattan and Queens and Brooklyn, with Staten Island trailing at the end of the long tow rope of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and keeps the whole business from drifting away on a strong outgoing tide. No water comes between the Bronx, if you leave out its own few islands, and the rest of North America. The Bronx is the continent, and once you're on it, you can go for thousands of miles without seeing ocean again. The other boroughs, for their part, cling to the Bronx for dear life. The chafing and strife of this connection have made all the difference to the Bronx. The northernmost part of the Bronx's western border is the Hudson River. Then Manhattan fits up next to the Bronx on its western side for more than half its length, lying approximately north and south. Here, the Harlem River, which is a strait and not a river, and which connects the East River to the Hudson, runs between the two boroughs. Steep hills and bluffs rise above the Harlem River Valley. Much of the Bronx is hilly. Stone ridges extend like tendons, knuckles, and fingers from the northern border of the borough southward. These discourage the construction of east-west roads and make the Bronx difficult to cross from east to west even today. After the Harlem River branches off around one side of Randall's Island, a smaller tidal stream, the Bronx Kill, continues along the borough's southern border. Going along the top of Randall's, the Bronx Kill also flows into the East River, which is part of Long Island Sound, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean. The Bronx's entire eastern border is the East River and the Sound. Thus, the borough has a major river that comes from inland, the Hudson, to its west, and saltwater on its east. Some of the Bronx is rocky and wooded, like upstate, and some is oceanfront marsh and beach. A straight line with a few bureaucratic zigzags marks the Bronx's northern border. That line is also the border of New York City. In general, people in the suburbs to the north of this line are richer than most people in the Bronx. By some measurements, large areas of the Bronx are poorer than anywhere else in the nation. But that assumes a population frozen in time. Everybody has to start somewhere. And the poor parts of the Bronx are often where people start when they have very little. They work and earn, and in time, they may move upward and new arrivals take their place. This cycle has tended to wear out some areas of the Bronx. The Bronx is the part of New York where the city merges into the rest of North America. The process has never gone smoothly. Its name honks, Bronx. Ideally, we could ask for a better sounding name, one that did not suggest a Bronx cheer, but Bronx is what we've got. The name comes from the Bronx River, which begins at a reservoir north of the city and runs south through the middle of the borough until it empties into the East River. The Bronx cuts the Bronx into two sections, east of it and west of it. Surface streets sometimes dead end at it. If you're at ground level and not on one of the big highways, you can go for a mile or more without finding a bridge. From source to mouth, the river is 23 miles long, with about 8 of those miles in the borough. It is the longest river within the borders of New York State, within the border of New York City. In December of 1639, several local Lenape headmen sold 500 acres of land adjoining the river to Jonas Bronk, a Swede who had arrived on his own ship, the Fire of Troy. One day, fire and destruction would be what people thought of when they thought of the Bronx. Bronk built a house on what's now 132nd Street, or maybe 138th Street. In either case, it was in what's now a southerly part of the South Bronx, and leased his land out for farming maize and tobacco. Eventually, the river at the eastern edge of his holdings became known as Bronx River, and Bronx land was the area in general. A man named Peter Schorstenweger, chimney sweep in Dutch, owned a farm next to Bronx, which he cultivated using black slaves. Apparently, Schorstenweger's River was never even in the running as a name, such being the workings of everyday poetics and spoken language.
Thank you. I saw a bunch of nods in the audience when you talked about how hard it is to go east and west, and also when you talked about the hilliness of the Bronx. And I know you know that in part through your body, through walking. Could you tell us the origin story of this book in walking the Stella d'Oro?
Well, I assume people know Stella d'Oro and the story of Stella d'Oro. I covered that for the New Yorker, their strike in, I think it was like 2009. The piece came out in 2011. But I spent a lot of time at the Stella d'Oro Bakery with the strikers and got to know some of them. And one thing that I had never really experienced before, and probably a lot of people here know what I'm talking about, is the importance of a smell to a neighborhood. And how that smell was just, I never experienced it before. Maybe in a European city where I would smell bread sometimes, but nothing like that. And the other thing was, it was seasonal, and it varied. You would get something that smelled like brownies, and then you would get something that smelled like anisette toast, and then you would get, all these different amazing smells. And I thought, what a resource, and to have. And I thought, I wonder how much of the Bronx is affected by this. So I walked, smelling at each block. I'm like, yeah, I could still smell it. Yeah, I could still smell it. And I mean, I came well up into Riverdale, and I could still smell it on some days. But, I'd be hanging out there, and then I would take a break, and I would walk east and see how far this smell extended. And sometimes with the wind, I mean, I say in the book it would be like a mile. I don't know if that's an exaggeration, but I do feel like it was very present and very mobile. It could, with the wind and stuff, it could move around. And when the Stella d'Oro Bakery was shut down by the hedge fund or private equity firm that had bought it, they actually sold it to an even bigger, a much bigger snack food company, and they moved it to Ohio. I already had this, experience of walking around, and I just had never really done that. I thought, this is really amazing, and so I just kept walking. And I had already done a piece on Co-op City, and I had walked all over Co-op City in that part of the Bronx, so I knew the way, like how Co-op City, I mean, that's a swamp, basically, and you're going down, and how quickly it is, you get down to the ocean there. And I am a huge fan of Sonia Sotomayor, and I had read her book very closely, and I saw, she lived in a building at the very top end, the northern part of Co-op City, and she walked to Cardinal Spellman High School. And I figured out, how did she go, And she crossed, I-95, she crossed a bunch of roads. It was not an easy walk. And so I just felt like that's how I don't have any authority. I don't live here. I never lived here. I've never lived in any of the places I've written about. I never lived on the Great Plains. I never lived in Siberia. I wrote books about both. But I thought, this is authority. If I can just say, so I set out to walk 1,000 miles in the Bronx. Whether I achieved it, I can't swear, because I wasn't keeping real close track. And I started walking before I was measuring that. But so for me, it was authority. It was a way of saying, I know this place, because I know it in my muscles from just going up and down and going across and all these long walks. So it was a way of getting to feel like that I had enough that I could write a book about it.
One of the other walks besides the Sotomayor walk that really stuck with me was the Jimmy Carter motorcade walk. And for folks who've read the book, I'm sure that made an impression on you as well. Can you say a little bit about what you learned about that history by walking that route?
Well, I was so impressed by that, Carter doing that, and I'm still impressed by it when I see how risky it was and how, in fact, he took lumps for it, because for a president to go out and, look overwhelmed, as Carter did, it was a brave thing to do, but it called attention. I mean, it really made a difference. It called national attention to this place. And so the New York Times, I found the Times issue that covered that event, and it printed a really detailed map of exactly where the motorcade went. And so I just, printed that out, and I had the actual map, and I walked that. And I walked it many times. It's 9.9 miles by my phone. And just to see how, first, it had changed. The famous pictures, most were at Charlotte Street and Boston Road. And go to Charlotte Street, wow, it doesn't look anything like those pictures. So it was a way of seeing, like, viscerally sort of how the Bronx had changed. And it was a way of, as I say in the book, I think that whole route should be a historic site. There are places, like on Civil War battlefields, where they'll say, Stonewall Jackson's troops walked down this road, the road is still there, and then they cut through this field, and the field is still there. Or I was out in Illinois, and Joseph Smith walked from the Mormon town at Nauvoo to Carthage, Illinois, right before he was murdered by a mob. And that route has been marked out like every 50 feet because Joseph Smith is a person of great, who's highly revered. And so I feel like you could do that with that. You could say, he went up the Grand Concourse and, he went over on Tremont and then he went down Washington and, then, and do that whole thing. It's another way. What happens in a place is always there. And I feel like that great thing that Carter did is on that route still.
There's actually a quote from the book that I wanted to read that relates to that and see and let you kind of riff off of it. So this is on page 24. What has existed in a place and what has happened there are hard to cover up. The past bleeds through layers of accumulation like graffiti through whitewash. The truth of a place often is not hidden but can be seen in plain sight. Bulldoze enough dirt, slap down enough paving, and run enough traffic over the past, and you can sometimes eliminate it in one location, only to have it pop to the surface in another. I don't know why this kind of survival fascinates me. I guess it's connected to the idea of eternity, to the way the world might be in the mind of God, or in the non-existent mind of the God who doesn't exist. I like to think about things that have always been the same, from rewrote human history up to and including now. People's heads have always been about as hard as they are today, and have hurt about the same amount when they bump together. Horses have always shaken flies off themselves, whether waiting to pull Pharaoh's chariots or standing in a kiddie ride at a county fair. Meat cooking on a fire has smelled delicious in exactly the same way forever. And that really struck me as something that makes this book special, is that you're always making these connections between past and present that are not just about this happened in this place, but that there's something that kind of sticks there. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, it's just the thrill of like you step into eternity and like you say, this is a thing that, it's like the Pythagorean theorem. It's true for any, A, B, it's true for any equation you want to plug into it throughout all numbers in the world. It's like, I'm not explaining that well because I'm not a math guy, but but the fact that, as I say, meat cooking on a fire has always smelled delicious to human beings. I mean, it's just something that has always been and always will be. It just like takes you out of your daily life. I mean, all of us are given those, 8 digits with the hyphen in between, I was born in 1951. There's a hyphen, and I don't know what the last 4 numbers will be. But we're confined within that space, within that time. And to be able to step out of it and to say, this is what a Muncie Indian would have seen. This is, the idea that you can step out of that limitation of time is intoxicating to me. And it's amazing how many opportunities there are for it and how often it comes up. I was just reading today that they're going to close Monsignor Preston High School.
Yeah, Preston High School.
Yeah. And I just, that's terrible. J-Lo went there. And there was an amazing excavation of a Native American site where part of Preston High School is now. And I forget who did it. Wasn't Casimiro who did it, but somebody, a local historian did it. And there are papers written about it. All these interesting things that were found there. And that, we're so ready to discard and throw things away. And the past is redolent in these places. So, I don't know. It's just, as I say, it's intoxicating to me. And it many people don't share this, but some do. And I'm glad of that.
Yeah, looking at the faces in the audience, I think you're in a room full of many people who share that. I see that pleasure kind of passing around. One of the other things that I think makes this book really special is that besides the walking as a way of learning about the Bronx, is that you do a really deep dive into 2 oral history archives, the MacDonald Papers at the Westchester Historical Society and the Bronx African American History Project at the Bronx County Historical Society and at Fordham. And I would love to hear you say a little bit more about just what it was like working with those collections. For me, I thought I knew a good bit about Bronx history, but the whole story of the neutral ground in particular was just not one that I was familiar with. And I kind of thought, not really into like war history, and the book brought it to life for me in a way that it had not been before. And I think that comes a little bit, maybe I'm prejudiced, but from the oral history.
Well, one of the difficulties the Bronx has, and a point that I make in my book and very much made in the excerpt from the book that appeared in the New Yorker, is that the Bronx is a place in between. And it has a unified history, but it has a divided history in the sense that it was Westchester County, and then Westchester County moved north, and it became the Bronx, and the history of the Westchester County period of its history is at the Westchester County Historical Society. So that I would love to see the MacDonald Papers available much more widely than they are. As far as I know, you have to go to this Historical Society itself and read them. But they're fascinating. This guy went around, a lawyer, and he essentially deposed people who had lived here during the American Revolution. And he got all of this oral history, all this testimony about, not testimony, but just, what people remembered he did this in like 1840 something. And there were a lot of people who had been kids during the Revolution who remembered that time. And so you have this amazing record. And as far as I know, it's handwritten. I mean, what I read was a photocopy. But these are incredible stories by people who were guides, for the British, or people who had their house burned down, or people who had their wealth plundered. It was a place where you got plundered by people coming from the north and people coming from the south. And such an important resource. And then the Bronx African American History Project, which was put together by Fordham, which is an incredible resource, which essentially starts with the Great Migration. And it starts with Jewish immigration to the Bronx, and that people, I think some of the oldest people that it talks to go back to the early 20th century. They were, this started in I forget when they started doing it. But it's a great addition that Fordham, and a great gift that Fordham gave to the Bronx. But when you put the two together, you see that the history of 1777 and the history of 1977 were very similar in unexpected ways. That this was a time of real turmoil, burning, all kinds of difficult things people were going through when this was the neutral ground between the British and the Americans, and when there's a great documentary, Decade of Fire, which I think the decade is like maybe 75 through 85 or something like that. But those two periods are both very similar. And in a way, you can kind of say, both were the results of things that people did in a place that was divided, in a place that was in between. And so I'm a huge fan of oral histories. And if you have, now you can find the Bronx African American History Project is online. And you can, during COVID, I read for days. I read days and days. I did nothing but read those oral histories. They're really beautiful.
Yeah, I think we often think about the history of cities that they kind of grow, they reach their peak, and then they decline, and then that's it. And the way you tell the story of the Bronx, we've got paradise, chaos, paradise, chaos.
Right.
And the last period of chaos that you're writing about is the 70s and 80s.
Right.
What do you think? What do you think is what period are we in now, and what do you see as being sort of next for the Bronx?
Well, what happened to Stella D'Oro really informed how I looked at a whole lot of things. And one thing that, when people think of gentrification, they think of, certain people are moving out and certain people are moving in. But to me, it's more like an intensification of financial and other kinds of pressure. So that, you might not have people moving out of the building, or that is, there might not be a lot of change in who's on the, door buzzer, the name, but that apartment would have a lot more people in it than it did, that people are doubling up. Just for an example, what happened to Stella D'Oro was you had 138 workers lost their jobs, and these were immigrants, almost all, and the nice family that owned Stella D'Oro before they went through their own tragedy when their son was killed in the earthquake in San Francisco, and they decided they're just going to sell the company because he was the one they hoped would take over. That company, when it was still the original Stella D'Oro, was like everything you could ask for a civic-minded company. And all these, lots of immigrants put their kids through college. Stella D'Oro was founded in, I think, 1931. So it prospered for a long time. And when you see what happened, why did they have to lose their jobs? If you looked at the website of Brynwood Partners, which was the private equity firm, it said, I haven't looked at it recently, but at that time it said that its investors were getting 28% a year returns. And they're going to take away the Stella D'Oro workers' birthday. Everybody got their birthday off at Stella D'Oro with pay. And they took that away. What do you gain? So to me, what I'm seeing now feels like an intensification of pressure. It's not just high rises going up, which are some of them are really nice. I went and looked at an apartment on the 19th floor. Down, it's all the way down by the Harlem River in the South Bronx. And I could see all the way down Manhattan. I could see all the way up through the Bronx. It was a spectacular place. But that isn't the only measure of how it happens. It's an intensification of pressure. If they drive the small auto businesses out on, it's not Webster. What is it? Jerome. Okay. Black and Jerome. I got it. If they drive them out of Jerome Avenue, that's just an intensification of pressure. That means you're going to get more street mechanic people who are not paying city taxes. That means you're going to get more people losing their jobs. It just seems senseless to me. So but I do have a political axe, I guess, and a writer should be more objective than that. But I just feel like, don't drive everybody out of Jerome Avenue.
Besides the oral histories and the walking, and I'm bringing this up because we're an audience of local historians and local history fans here, you're also really standing on the shoulders of many generations of Bronx local historians. Can you say a little bit about what makes a local historian great? And some local historians, they kind of get caught in their little thing, and some really make something that someone can build on, or that someone 100 years or 200 years later even can come and pick up and use. So who are your favorite Bronx local historians, and how did you use their work?
I am I can't quite say a child of Lloyd Altan, but I certainly talked to Lloyd Altan a bunch. He was very generous with his time. And what I would say makes a great historian, Lloyd Altan loves the Bronx. And when you read, he'll just describe something, and it seems quite small. I actually quoted it in my book, where he describes the way the streetcars used to reach the end of the line and then they would flip all the seats to face the other direction, and they would switch the pole that went up to the overhead wire. And he just describes it so lovingly and so step by step. And honestly, when you're writing, you're thinking all the time, is this interesting? And that didn't stop him at that. Is this going to interest people? Yes, it is. I'm interested in it. I loved it as a boy. And I think that all local historians, I think, have a love for what they're doing. What really lifts you above is if you can see it from the point of view of somebody who doesn't know what you're talking about. It sometimes you get very, it happens to any historian or any writer for that matter, you get very close to it. I think a historian who can kind of step back and it helps, I think, just to try it out on people, because you do get, this is something, I did this thing for CBS Sunday Morning, and the woman who interviewed me, Susie Essen, began by saying, "Why the Bronx?" And of course, she's right. That is what you do meet with any subject. But why, But I was thinking, Did they ask that of Homer? Like, why the Trojan War? The Bronx. Why? What do you mean, why? Well, I did my best to answer it, and I think it is a fair question. But because you do have to see that you get skepticism from somebody. Anybody picks up a book, there's a headwind of skepticism, and you have to kind of account for it at least.
Even though we have this great heritage of local historians, Bronx historians, you point out throughout the book, this place, there really should be a plaque. This other place, how could there be no marker here?
If they left it up to me, I'd slap plaques all over them. There's so many great places for plaques that don't have them. Cedar Playground, it's just begging for a plaque. This is the first Cool Herc Jam. There isn't an actual official plaque on 1520 Sedgwick. You can tell that it is a historic place because there's a bunch of stuff there. But an actual plaque saying who this guy was, how his family came here, I feel like that would be just at the very least to do one at Cedar Playground, which, that's another thing where you're thinking in terms of like what was here before, where you're trying to hear something from the past. I just go to Cedar Playground and just sit there on an average kind of ordinary day and just imagine, it's like, 10:30 at night, the speakers are the size of small houses, they're hooked up to the street lamps. When they crank up, the street lamps are dimming, and the sound is so loud. Grandmaster Flash said the first time he heard it, it wasn't only the loudest music he had ever heard, it was the loudest sound he had ever heard. And I know that feeling from my own youth, where you just want to blast it. And I sit there, and it's now quiet, and it's now, Major Deegan is right there. It's not quiet necessarily, but it's nothing's really happening. Maybe a couple kids are playing basketball. But, there are a lot of places. There's, I could come up with a long list of places to put plaques.
Why do you think the history of the Bronx is so hard to see in that way? Do you think there's anything in particular about the Bronx that makes it erase its history?
Well, anything that's near traffic gets erased. It's just like, no. And it's like, where am I, I feel like the fact that so many people pass through it without looking at it. One reason that Carter's drive-through happened was that Andy Rooney, who at the time worked for CBS, I think he worked for CBS his whole career, was driving through it he had two upstate houses, and he's driving through it, and he says, this seems to be on fire, and, and so he goes to the head of CBS and says, Has anybody done anything about this? Have we reported on this? And so CBS did do something about it. Bill Moyers was the moderator, and it won a lot of prizes. It was a good piece. And that piece, somebody sent to Jody Powell, who was Carter's chief of staff, and Jody Powell gave it to Carter, and Carter watched it and said, "My gosh, this is horrible," and asked his whole cabinet to watch it. And I think that began the focus, But think of the millions and millions of people that have passed through and not thought of saying anything, especially people with country, with houses out in Long Island or upstate, people with some power and influence, presumably, and, finally somebody noticed. But it gets erased by the fact that people go by without looking.
Hearing you talk about Cool Herc reminded me of the fact that one of the other things that you draw out as being special about the Bronx, besides that it's in between and that it's connecting to the mainland, is that it's part of the birthplace of cool. And you draw that all the way back to Anne Hutchinson, which I think is a bold move. Can you tell everybody why Anne Hutchinson is so cool?
This is a thought I had years ago reading about Anne Hutchinson, where I was thinking just the idea of predestination, which is a kind of complicated theological idea, but basically it means that God has picked you for paradise, for heaven. You're going to heaven no matter what you do on earth. From birth, or even before, that's you. God has chosen you. And that then you live in this, you are one of the elect. And that was what Anne Hutchinson believed. And I have no doubt she thought she was one of the elect. And the thing about being one of the elect is you can't mess it up. It's just, that's you. That's it. Well, then I thought, what is like that? Cool is like that. If you're cool, you just are. Not like somebody said, oh, you're cool because of. You're just cool. And furthermore, if you try and become cool, it only makes you more uncool. So that those two aspects of American life, predestination was a huge battle and among sectarian, groups across the country, of various religions, like where you stood on the idea of election or predestination was a big, big divider. Well, back in the 19th century when America had hundreds and hundreds of Protestant sects, a lot of them divided along this question. And that, I think, translated into the idea of cool, that cool is secular predestination. And I wouldn't even be surprised if somehow the idea of church music figured into it. I'm not sure how that would exactly work. But I do think it's one of the great American inventions. And when you travel and you see people trying in other countries, trying to be cool in an American way, they have their own cool. But they're trying to be cool in an American way. No, it's not going to work. I'm sorry. I've seen French people trying to be cool. Nothing against the French, but they got their own thing. The American cool is kind of untranslatable, and it is it's very attractive. I think that it's kind of behind the attraction of something like the American invention, like rock and roll. And Anne Hutchinson got in a huge amount of trouble for just saying, hey, I'm cool, I'm predestined, live with it. And she got kicked out of Massachusetts Bay Colony for just not, following what the directors of the colony wanted her to do and calling them whited sepulchres. So I don't know that she actually used that term, but she was, she was kicked out for excessive self-confidence. Anyway, that's my cool theory.
I really
I've expounded on this a few times, and again, I haven't really got a theological total grip on it, but I think there's something to it.
I really like thinking about Cool Herc being predestined. Grandmaster Flash.
Oh, yeah.
Predestined.
I mean, just imagine Cool Herc like walking into Cedar Playground, like, wow, you know. He wore like big Superfly type hats. And, he was pretty recently the family had come from Jamaica pretty recently. And that's another whole story, is that when we're talking about immigration, that Immigration Act of like 64, how it changed American culture, because suddenly you were, you know, all these, what had been de facto color bars were dropped, and suddenly you have all these people from particularly the West Indies, and West Indies dance music with those massive speakers was a big contribution to hip hop.
I could sit here and ask you questions about the Bronx all day, all night, but I think other people probably have questions as well. So maybe now would be a good time to open it up for audience questions. What do y'all want to know?
So when you talk about Jimmy Carter's visit to Charlotte Street and went from urban wasteland to modest homes owned by immigrants, now those homes are worth many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars, right, and in danger of being knocked down again to be replaced by large buildings. Do you see that with a sense of irony, or is that typical of the wave of the Bronx from wasteland to gentrification?
It's just dizzying. I mean, there was so much controversy over Charlotte Gardens, you know, because what you have there is houses for, you know, 5 people on infrastructure that was intended for hundreds and hundreds of people in these same blocks. And that was controversial then. The houses, I mean, I know people over there who I've talked to, and they tell me what the value of their house is if they go on Zillow or something. And it's gone way up. To be honest, I didn't know they're knocking down houses there.
Well, the zoning is still the high-density zoning it was before they ever built those. So they're like development sites now. If they could buy them, they could put up big buildings again.
If they sold, they could put up big buildings. Okay, wow. Well, I mean, a lot of the people, the original people, there are some. The people I know are not like ready to sell tomorrow. Well, what they tell me is it's going up, and they got X offer that was so incredible, and they didn't take it. So I don't know what the future will be of that, but wow.
I think one of the surprising discoveries in the book is Gouverneur Morris and how deeply you go in on him. And I think it's worth talking a little bit about that because, you know, you didn't hold back. So
I was one of the big problems of doing this kind of research is rabbit holes, obviously. And I got into Governor Morris, and he was a graphomane. So you can read his diary, and it's incredibly explicit. I'm like, wow, this is written in whatever it was, like the 1790s. And he's describing all this stuff in revolutionary Paris. He's the only ambassador still there. You know, he has every reason to fear for his life because aristocrats are being killed on the street. And he hangs in there, and I couldn't put it down, honestly. And so I put it in the book, and I knew it was a big swerve. And I'm grateful to everybody that went with me. Because I really got a kick out of it. And I loved his mistress was just this incredible person where you can buy her books on Amazon still. Adele de Flahaut. And she was a writer later. She supported herself, having fled the revolution, by writing a kind of roman clef novels. But the other thing where I did kind of justify it is there's so many things named after him. And if you ask people, nobody knows. Nobody has any idea who he was. I mean, and it's important who he was. I think, again, the place in between, he was a person in between. And he was so, almost like a sociopath. I mean, he could disappear at a certain moment. And then he had this incredible vision of the U.S. And the fact that, again, a place in between, Morris, a person in between. New York State didn't like him. He didn't get reelected when he was a senator briefly, filling in for another senator. And because he was nowhere and nobody, in the sense that he wasn't Philadelphia Society, he wasn't Tidewater Society, he wasn't, the Adams Boston kind of society. He was this weird in-between person, and he could just step out of being who he was and say, "We the people." And what that preamble said before was, "We the people of Rhode Island Colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony, New York Colony, blah, blah, blah," all 13 listed. Didn't say colony, but of these various plantations and whatever they had long names, and it was this big long list. And for him to say, red pencil it, we the people. And that he could say, because he had fought and fought and fought to get slavery out of the Constitution. He despised slavery. Owned slaves, but despised slavery. And he tried so hard, and he gave such speeches about it, and he, really it was one of his big issues. So that he could say, in order to form a more perfect union, he's not saying we got it right. He's saying a more perfect union. And there's a realism about him. And I think a true, idealism that you hoped went into the founding of this country. That with him was, I feel like he was more a founding father that I could kind of relate to. As opposed to I love Thomas Jefferson, can't read enough about him, he's great, but, he had, I visited Monticello, and they had just done an archaeological dig at Monticello, and they had gone over all the garden grounds and the whole grounds of Monticello, and the one human, man-made thing that they found, iron thing that they found, was broken locks. So Jefferson had to lock up his pumpkins. He had to lock up his chicken coop. He had to, he was a slave owner, and he was insane. To think, he just really fries my grid in a way that Morris is kind of more straightforward, So that I put him in because I thought he had a claim to be a real original Bronxite, and because I admired him, I guess.
Hi, I'm one of the folks from the Kingsbridge Historical Society,
Oh.
and I was happy to hear you both talk about the issue of oral history, because one of the projects that we're working on at the Kingsbridge Historical Society is starting an oral history project. I don't believe there's ever been one at Kingsbridge. There have been some covering Riverdale. I'd like to ask if I could contact you both to help us, craft a new, fresh approach to oral history so we can continue the story of the Bronx.
Well, you've done oral histories, and you founded the one, right?
Yeah, definitely. We can talk oral history.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And the other person I would recommend is Mark Nason from...
I know him. I went to Fort.
Oh, you did? Okay, so you know him because he, I think, is the founder of that. I don't know.
Of the Bronx
Of the Bronx
African
African
American.
American. And he is a co-founder, I think. But anyway.
Yeah, and the Bronx County Historical Society also does, and I don't want to put you all on the spot, but a ton of oral history, so it can be mentoring that too, I think.
I had two questions interrelated. Number one is, what surprised you the most of what you found? You were writing there and, geez, it was just kind of, and the second one is, who that you came across in the Bronx, you're doing your history, made you say, gee, I wish I could find out more about that person? Because I remember one time asking someone about George Washington, they said, there's so little on George Washington's father. But what surprised you that you found, and B, what kind of person that you got so interested that you couldn't, was there a dead ends with any people, or that you wanted to know more about, or did that occur at all?
Well, I came to this originally with the mindset of someone who wasn't from here and had basically bought the bogus line. I mean, I thought, so that when I first started going up to Celadoro, I think, I would have some trepidation, like, is this safe?
Yeah.
Mhm.
And what surprised me was, it sounds kind of corny, but people were so nice. And I could go to a lot of neighborhoods where, most people spoke Spanish or something, and the people would just be nice to me. And I would just sit on the bench. And fortunately, I started this once I was old enough to be like an old guy. So that when I was sitting on the bench, I was an old guy sitting on the bench. I wasn't somebody from somewhere else. I was another old guy sitting here. And I was just delighted in people going, "Hey, Poppy." I was just, yeah, thank you. That's what I like. I like to be thought of as Poppy. So, I mean, it shouldn't have surprised me. But I would say it did. And I still get people saying, "Oh, is it dangerous stuff?" Well, it's terribly dangerous for children in certain neighborhoods. I mean, that was something that and I put in the book, it just wrings your heart. You go down and you see the memorial for these kids and, all the candles and everything. And it just seems like, can't we stop this? I mean, my ancestors fought in the Civil War, and at the beginning, they fought for the North, and at the beginning there was slavery, at the end there was. And if somebody said to me, you could go through 5 years of misery, and it was misery for them when they described marching and being in these battles and so on. And then you could go through that and there would be no more kids shooting kids. I'd do it in a second. But that's a whole other kind of side thing. So I was surprised by how nice it was. The people that I would like to know more about, I think you could do a whole other book. Like, you can look up anything named after somebody. You can look it up pretty much. So, like, you'll see a name, and I would like to be able to know a lot about that person. If a place is named for Evelina Antonetti, right? You should just be able to go and they tell you everything about Evelina Antonetti. So I ended up, in that chapter where I talk about all the things that people are named after people, I had so much in there that people said, this is just too long. And I had to say at the end, we need like a World War memorial with all these names on it, in addition to on all the street signs and playgrounds and parks and stuff like that, that you want it all in one spot. That would be, again, along with my plaque idea. But I always did want to find out more. And when I did, I saw the sign for Jerry Lamb. Jerry Lamb was a neighborhood activist over in Hunts Point, and just find out about her. And I did finally find out her. So it's something I wish it was easier to do and you could find out more.
Thank you.
I don't think the idea of the plaques is so outlandish. I heard on the news like last week on the local news that there's a project in Harlem where they're doing that, putting plaques on houses of people who are not necessarily famous, but locally famous. And I think it would be a great thing to do throughout the city.
I mean, in my hometown, small town in Ohio, Hudson, Ohio, I had a friend, and the mother of a friend of mine, who saw that these some nice houses were old houses were in danger of being torn down, and she made historic markers herself. So I could make a plaque and put it up. Or, I mean, that's a good point, and I would like to see it happen. It's not.
We've actually done a little bit of that in Mott Haven, where we've made just like those vinyl banners that you can like zip tie onto a chain link fence with like an old picture of the place
Mhm.
and a clip of an oral history that you can go with your phone and
Oh,
listen
yeah,
to it.
that's
So
cool.
I think everybody here has their marching orders to make some historical markers, whatever is important to you.
I was wondering if you could help some of us Bronx people with your perspective of someone who wasn't from here. You know, you've written and studied about many other areas, you grew up in other areas. And I guess one example would be, Al Pacino just wrote a recent biography, from 80 years out. He's looking back at an amazing career. Some of the highlights took place in the Bronx. The famous scene from The Godfather on White Plains Road and Gun Hill Road. But of all the parts of his book, the emotional high point is his memories of the Bronx River and jumping into the Bronx River and being 8 and being 12 and the
Wow.
food vendors, right? It's an emotional high point. One of the things you notice of people who grew up in the Bronx is they're maybe sociopathically connected to their youth in a way. And I'm wondering from the perspective of an outsider who so brilliantly reflected all the memories of the hundreds of people you encountered, are we sociopathically different than others? Is there a reason we are, or is it just human nature to be connected to the memories?
That is a very good point, and it gives me something next time people say, why the Bronx? I come from a small town, which I am, and I lived there 12 years of my life, and I'm 74. And I think about that town all the time. Like James Thurber grew up in Columbus, and he said, the clocks that ring in my dreams are the clocks of Columbus. You get attached, and it's weird. I don't know why. I have only written about places, really. I mean, and why do I do that? I don't think. I think that kind of attachment is not all that common anymore. People grow up and leave places. Kids leave where they were, where they were raised very often. And I think that in order, that's one thing that makes me cringe every time they're going to, do something in my town. I just flip out. My town had a water tower, an old-time Midwestern water tower. And when they took the water tower down, why? How can you do that? My God. So I think, I don't know. I have an attachment to a place, and I think when I read memoirs, there's a copy over there, Arlene Alda's book, Kids in the Bronx, I think it's called. And you read these people, they're amazing attachments, stuff they remember. I found it a fascinating book, and I really related to it. Like that was something I would, if somebody interviewed me about Hudson, they'd have trouble shutting me up. Yes.
I look forward to reading the book. I wondered if you could share a story or something about Riverdale or Spuyten Duyvil or Kingsbridge, where our beloved neighborhoods here.
Well, this is where the owners of they live pretty close to here. The owners of Stella D'Oro lived up here. And so I went to their house just to see where they lived. And they had a tulip tree, and I'm not sure it was in their yard, but it was near there. And this tulip tree was like 200 feet tall. I mean, it's the biggest tulip tree I ever saw. And I went back with a friend of mine who knows a lot about trees in the city. And this tulip tree has a lightning rod on top of it, which to me is astonishing, that you have a tree so tall you have to put a lightning rod on it. This is a place of kind of high drama in Fenimore Cooper's book. The Neutral Ground, I think it's called? The Spy by Fenimore Cooper. And there's a bad guy in The Spy. And he is taken, in the book, which is a fictional book, he is taken to a bluff over the Hudson River at the very end of the book and hanged and left there hanging out over the river as a way, I guess, to scare off his evil compatriot or his evil comrades. But this is like a real kind of dramatic place. At the very beginning of my book, I start at the house where JFK was a boy. And I just found that so moving, to think of that family. And the house seemed like totally unchanged, and there was nothing there, and there was nobody keeping me from walking right up to the windows and looking in until later. Then they did get some security there. But it is a really amazing house. And Joseph Kennedy was there, and, you know, so, and to think of Sonia Sotomayor walking to school, John Kennedy was 11 and walked down to whatever school is at the bottom of that hill. Riverdale. Okay. Yeah. But so, you know, thinking of them living in this place, and Joe Kennedy, you know, the father, having his limo pick him up, take him down to Wall Street. And they didn't live here that long. They moved, I think, maybe back to Boston, I forgot. But
Bronxville.
Did they move?
Bronxville.
Okay. And Rose was miserable there. It was a miserable time, really. It's amazing that John Kennedy turned out as well as he did. He had such a horrible dad.
What would you say is your favorite walk to take in the Bronx? And also, like, what's your favorite neighborhood in the Bronx? Or your favorite
Gosh, favorite walk? I would have to say the Jimmy Carter walk because I've done it a lot and I really like it. I feel familiar with it. Favorite neighborhood is right around Playground 52, Kelly Street. I love that place down there. I hang out in that Playground 52. They have salsa concerts every Wednesday night in the summer, and I go to them. So, yeah, that's a place I feel really comfortable. I think it's now renamed Al Quinones Playground, if I'm not mistaken. But I never met Al Quinones, but I was over there. This guy is like a local saint almost, or a combination saint and something else, because he was a pretty mixed type of person. People say both good and bad about him, but he saved that playground. And he is so many people told me, you know, what stuff Al Quinones did. And that's another example of somebody where you see the name and you want to know who this person was. But this is a place, one guy saved it, you know, and it was a drug dealer place, it was a mess, and he saved it and hung in there, and so I like that playground a lot. I love going to the salsa evenings there.
Hi, thanks for being here tonight. I was born in the Bronx, but left for a while, back and forth, but I ended my social work career in the Bronx and at the VA, and I used to drive around a lot. And at one point, I kept passing this one street that I kept saying to myself, where did they name this thing from? And it's called Featherbed Lane. Right. And I wondered if you could tell me.
Well, there's a really good book over there called History in Asphalt by
John McNamara.
And it tells this a couple stories of where that name came from. But over there, you can stand at the corner of Featherbed and Shakespeare. Wow. I mean, how can you not love that? That's just incredibly great. But, you know, the story is that they put feather beds out so that the cobblestones wouldn't, you know, make a lot of noise when the Americans were trying to slip away from the British after the British had moved up in here. But I don't know.
Thank you.
That's
now I know.
How's your salsa dancing?
Terrible. I tore my Achilles tendon, so I'm not really much of a dancer. But I love to watch salsa dancing. It's just that place is really like a center of salsa. And the guy who has the longest duration records, the store, I can't remember his name. The record store right below the Prospect L station. Anyway, he's there. Mike Amadeo is the guy's name. He's there a lot, and he's like, he's like, I think almost 90, and he recorded his first salsa hit when he was like 16, I think. And he's been doing this forever. So it's a good source. It's a good place to hang out.
Hi, so I was interested in the, when you mentioned plaques, and one of my favorite plaques is actually on Prospect Ave, near the 2 train, on the Melody, the building itself. It's a really nice plaque when you read it, because it talks a lot about the history in that neighborhood, about how so many genres, grew out of the Bronx and what have you. And still to this day, like, when I ask people, like, have they seen it, like, because it on the exterior, it looks very different from, like, other buildings. I'm a cyclist, so, like, I'm always on the bicycle lanes, but I'm also a walker or a runner, and so anytime I'm doing any of those activities, I always point people to, like, well, first I ask them, like, have you ever seen this plaque?
Mm-hmm.
And so I do encourage people to visit and just look at it.
Yeah, that was, I think Mark Nason had something to do with that too. I think so. Yeah, that's a good plaque. It's kind of, in 200 words, sums up the musical history of that neighborhood, and it's really, that was a good idea.
So I want to tell you something, I hope it'll make you feel better in response to something you said about people not feeling the same way about where they come from. So like you, during the pandemic, I was reading through Bronx history in the form of 100 years of newsletters from the amalgamated houses, and then 50 years of newsletters from their nursery school, to write a little history of the nursery school. And I was really taken by the extraordinary stories and the voices you hear through the newsletters, particularly through the nursery school, because they're women writing about being mothers and living in this community. So I teach at Leland College, and my freshman seminar last semester, I asked the students, who were mostly from the Bronx, start with your own education history, and then go find a school that's named after someone and tell me who that person was. And I will tell you all here that some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read in my life is from the students at Leland College writing about their own history, their own educational history. They love the Bronx in the same way that the people from the amalgamated houses love their community. So I think the good news is that's still alive and well.
That is good news, yeah.
That feels like a good place to end. There's one more little thing I want to read from the book, if that's okay.
Okay.
That kind of a gift for this audience. It's in the section about Lloyd Alton, who there's this great description. His eyebrows are pure white, and they spring out above his lively dark eyes like spray in front of a speeding boat. So picture that. And it says local boosters told him that he helped save the borough by talking it up. And you say, I have no doubt that's true. And then, I believe that historians can heal a place. I once saw a documentary about a shaman midwife who brought women through difficult childbirth by telling them tales made up on the spot about the journey of the baby. Historians do something similar, birthing the present from the past. Ideally, the stories they tell possess the mystery that comes from being true. So for this audience of historians and lovers of history, I want to leave you with that. And also really with the mission to go out and make these plaques happen, because I'm totally with you that we need a lot more.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all for joining us. Let's give it up again for Ian and Amy. And thank you again, Kingsbridge Historical Society. Nick, Tom, you want to say anything in closing?
Just thank you for all for coming, and I had a fabulous time listening to this. I hope to read more from you about different places.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Have a good night. Check out both of our websites, Kingsbridge Historical Society and Bronx Historical Society. We have events coming up, additional events. So hope to see you at some of those. Have a good night.